Well, welcome everyone. I'm very excited today for this e-panel, Mexico to the Americas, Sandbox Opportunity for FinTech. And I want to thank our great panelists for sharing their time and everyone else who's also listening in this crazy COVID pandemic environment. I hope everyone is safe, but we have some really good and interesting subject matter today. Mexico has been a hotbed for fintech and innovation. I think over the last 2 years, over 100 venture companies have been funded. That is up almost 50% from the previous couple of years. Our panelists are fantastic. Very quickly, we have Santiago Gallardo. He's head of investor relations at BIVA. Then we have Blanca Cordova, who is head of fintech advisory at KPMG. We have Raul Salazar, who's the fintech director at DAI UK Prosperity Fund. And we have Kevin Seknicki, COO and co-founder of AVA Labs. Myself, my name is John Wu. I'm president of AVA Labs. We're all very excited to be here. I'll give you a little bit of my background first, and then maybe I'll open it up for some questions. So I have seen fintech innovation both from an investor's perspective as well as from an operator's perspective. And I've done it in the US, working very closely with the SEC. As an investor, I was at Tiger Management, Kingdom Capital, and I ran my own fund that was sponsored by the Blackstone Group. As an operator, I was CEO of the Digital Assets Group at Shares Post, where we tokenized and issued securities on private shares as well as funds, and did it in a regulatory compliant way with help from the SEC. Now at AVA Labs, we are building the next generation platform, I would say, that's going to allow everyone else to enable them to build great financial products as well as applications on top of our consensus protocol. I will leave that for Kevin to talk further. So with that, let's kick it off. Santiago, maybe we can start with you, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about BIVA and your own personal background. It's a very impressive background. I think BIVA is a relatively new exchange, only been around for 2 years. That's very impressive. How were you able to do that? And also, love to talk a little bit about blockchain and crypto exchanges if you have experience there as well.
Sure. Thank you, John. Thank you, AVA Labs, for the opportunity to talk here in this very interesting panel, and to the Sandbox Challenge as well, the CMBV for launching it. I think it's going to be a great experiment and a great place to innovate, and for Mexican companies to come up with new ideas in the Mexican marketplace. As you mentioned, I had the investor relation and indexing team in BIVA. BIVA stands for Bolsa Institucional de Valores. It's, as you mentioned, the second stock exchange in Mexico. We came up against the incumbent who has over 100 years of being here in the Mexican market as a sole competitor. We came live in July of 2018 after almost 6 years in the making. We're a technology-centered exchange. Technology is in our core. We focus on 3 main businesses. We do trading of stocks and listed securities. We also list securities, list debt issuances for private companies and governments as well. And we also sell our market data, which is one of the biggest growing businesses around as investors get more sophisticated and start to consume even more market data on a daily basis. So it's a really growing business. And you mentioned a particular thing, blockchain. We're starting to have a few projects around blockchain. There's a lot of things to do in blockchain in the traditional stock market, stock exchange business. From my point of view, the main or the key benefit of having blockchain in the ecosystem is for clearance and post-trade part of the equation. I think that having blockchain in that sort of thing would really eliminate the friction between participants, make things really cheaper for every participant, have a lot of transparency from the public, from the investors, as well as for the regulators. So I think this is going to happen sooner rather than later. We're actually speaking to some vendors and counterparties. In Chile, for instance, there's about to be a bond issuance from the central bank. It's going to be done through blockchain. So it's one of the first ones around the world, and the first one in Latin America. So we're working with some of those guys to see what we can do and what we can replicate or use here in Mexico to integrate that technology here. Regarding crypto exchanges, you touched an interesting point. My experience has always been with traditional equities. I worked for U.S. broker dealers for quite a while. Then I used to work in an OTC interdealer broker here in Mexico, and after that, I was one of the founders of BIVA over 6 years ago. So I've been in the process from top to bottom, and I have some really close friends who actually run one of the biggest Mexican crypto exchanges, and it's been a crazy thing. I mean, being from the traditional market, we've seen the crypto exchanges grow like crazy. I mean, for instance, just to give you a quick number, the biggest crypto exchange here in Mexico has around just under 1 million trading accounts with them. The exchange is called Bitso. And just to give you a bit of a perspective of here in Mexico, we have around 35 authorized broker dealers who can actually trade in the securities market. And in those 35 broker dealers, there are only under 300,000 brokerage accounts. So the traditional, the people here in Mexico are not used to investing their money using technology, using platforms. But when the crypto business came up with Bitcoin and the Bitcoin boom, people were really hyped and they wanted to trade and they had the curiosity to do it. So we're hoping to get some of that traction into the organized traditional securities market, and that's just a bit of background. We'll get more into it a little bit later, John.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Santiago. Mexico obviously is a country where financial inclusion is a big part of the subject matter. In fact, I think 40% I read surveys where 40% of the citizens have not invested in financial products. Not sure if that is correct for crypto.
Exactly. Just to give you, we're a 120 million people country. And as I mentioned, there are under 300,000 trading accounts. That's nothing. That's really way under around 1% of the population. In the US, it's around 50% of the population invests directly in stocks. If you get into an Uber and your driver is probably trading in a Robinhood app stocks in the exchange and has their savings managed by himself, whereas here in Mexico, you have your toe in the securities market through your Afore, through your pension fund, if you're in the formal market, but you're not in constant contact with the market, or you're not really aware. There's really not that much education about investing on a retail basis.
Right. Hey, Kevin, I was hoping related to this subject matter, you can introduce yourself, what AVA Labs is. And I know from an AVA perspective, you have talked to quite a few potential business partnerships down in Mexico and Latin America. Around the subject of financial inclusion, how can decentralization and what services and products AVA has will help all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a brief intro into AVA, I guess, is we are a platform that aims to do kind of what the early internet did to information, but with financial services. We want to democratize financial services in a way that really pushes the boundaries of what it really means for owning and transferring assets. Currently, there is overhead, there is lack of transparency, there is all kinds of crazy complexity, but it's not really an inherent property that is needed for the financial world to have. The complexity of the financial world has is just there because it's a system that has not really been overturned by innovators. It's really kind of been untouched for many decades, and we're building a platform that enables effectively people to program capital in free ways, in ways that really enable a lot of innovation. Things that are all kinds of services that are financial related, they can be developed quickly on our platform because we're building this fundamental new intranet for the creation of assets, the transferring of assets, and the programmability of assets. What are some of the key, sort of direct applications of what blockchain technology has enabled in the financial sector, without too much opining and philosophizing, just direct applications? There's tremendous ones of them. We're kind of seeing them develop right now, but a huge application, for example, that I'm particularly excited, especially for the Latin American market, is the use of blockchain infrastructures and the stable coins that are built on top of them to allow for really cheap remittance. This has been opined in the past, and some projects like Ripple and so on have tried to do this, but of course these are volatile assets that don't necessarily solve the issue fundamentally. The issue for remittance in Latin America is the fact that Western Union and Banco Pel and all these guys, they're in the business, but there's still a whole lot of middlemen that are involved in the transfer of money. Instead, what innovators did is that when they were given the ability to program money freely, they took that technology, they built a new asset that is backed 1-to-1 with US dollar, and all of a sudden you can move this asset freely from US to Mexico and back and forth at basically almost a fraction of the cost that you're able to do it right now. We're seeing this happening at very, very tiny scales. And my guess is that this is going to happen very, very soon at much larger scales. If I were to guess, while I'm not a betting man, if I were to bet, I would probably bet the Western Union kind of has a lot of its life towards the end of its cycle, really, because a lot of it is going to just change tremendously in the next few years. And this is only possible really because we build a platform, or not AVA, I'm just saying the broader blockchain technology builds platforms that allow money to be programmed. And stablecoins just were a natural application that were built on on programmability. And all of a sudden, in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to see all this massive infrastructure for onboarding fiat into crypto be leveraged for remittance. So that's just one direct application of blockchain technology that's going to really transform and make financial inclusion much more possible.
Very interesting. Blanca, Kevin just talked about a couple of themes there. One, innovators, developers of new products and new financial services in a probably more efficient manner. Secondly, we talked about legal frameworks, and sometimes that becomes a barrier. I think Mexico has done an unbelievable job in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of sparking entrepreneurship and creating certain legal frameworks so that companies feel comfortable in being innovative. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also give us a little bit more of a detailed background of yourself, please?
Yeah, completely. Thank you. As you mentioned, John, I am Blanca Cordova. I am the head of FinTech advisory at KPMG Mexico. And actually, in the firm globally, we have been tending the FinTech market for around 5 or 6 years at the moment. And this became very important for the Latin market from about 3 years ago. So we have been dedicated our efforts here in Mexico and the Latin region into developing 2 sets of FinTech solutions. The first ones are oriented to helping this FinTech ecosystem grow and thrive and really survive and become very important and stable companies in a Latin market that is a very complex market, especially here in Mexico. And the other set of solutions we have been developing revolves around FinTech solutions for our more corporate clients from the financial traditional sector or from other industries, where we so what we have identified at the moment in worldwide and naturally here in Mexico is that there was a sense of competition at the beginning, because maybe the more traditional players on the financial ecosystem believe that the FinTech companies could be a menace for some provision of specific services, being them more attractive to the market. But the real deal is that they are perfect complements and actually they're not competing for the same market at all. They both have strengths, and they both also have risks. And when you identify a smart integration or collaboration model between them, that's the way you can really create value for the market. So we here in KPMG in Mexico, and actually we operate as one firm with the United States and other 8 countries in Central and South America, who are focusing on developing solutions for really strengthening the ecosystem and helping them identify these collaboration models with the rest of the players in the financial sector and other industries, in order for them to really thrive and become strong companies. And in relation to what you were mentioning, actually the case here in Mexico is very interesting. We have this so-called fintech law. It is one of the most exhaustive models, regulatory frameworks in the world, actually. And it started not exactly from the government side, but from the industry side. I mean, there were this set of very active entrepreneurs that were really willing to interact with the government, especially with our National Banking and Security Commission, in order to identify, hey, this is my business model, this is my activities, I'm posing these risks, maybe I'm maybe thinking about these auto-regulatory frameworks, please help me have some certainty. What do you think? What other things should I consider? So there was like this very active participation from the business side. And finally, the fintech law was created in March of 2018, and it came into force in September of 2019. And from the opportunities this law generates into the Mexican, and well, you can also consider Latin American market, is that definitely having a legal framework provides any market with certainty over business models, consumer needs, and overall for risk and operational impacts. In the case of Mexico, this law is also special because compared to other regulations in the world, it includes the most business models. For example, this specific chapter includes crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, electronic money, open banking, and of course the regulatory sandbox. So this legal framework provides a very exhaustive, but at the same time a very lean compliance framework, so that companies can identify how to operate, where are the risks, and how to mitigate them. And actually, we believe that this law represents relevant opportunities in the Mexican market in three very concrete ways. The first one is that fintech startups and companies coming from other countries for expansion into Latin markets can explore Mexico first with the certainty that a lean regulatory framework provides over capitalization, risk management, operational impacts, and business activities scoping. I mean, there is something already built and you can work over that instead of coming and starting from scratch. So I think that's really valuable. In the second set of opportunities, we identify venture capital and equity funds can invest in licensed Mexican fintechs, having more certainty that they operate with recognized best-in-class frameworks, processes, and controls that increase the survival and thriving of these type of companies, alongside with the knowledge that they are being observed by local financial regulators, which increases their market value and trustworthiness in the eyes of the general public. And finally, fintech companies in Mexico are tapping opportunities by tending a market that traditional financial institutions can't or are unable to. This represents almost 63% of working adults that are currently underbanked or underserved. And I think this represents a relevant amount of business for companies that solve the very difficult challenge of creating the right incentives by understanding our cash culture. So it is not an easy task to deploy solutions that address Mexican and Latin American culture. But there are lots of fintech companies here in Mexico locally that are achieving this purpose. So I believe if you are coming to this market and you make it work in Mexico, then you can make it work anywhere else in the region.
Thank you, Blanca. Raul, I was hoping you can give a little summary of what DIA UK Prosperity Fund does. And as Blanca mentioned, I don't think it's coincidental that since there was a legal framework put in place about 2 or 3 years ago, that there's been great growth in the fintech startup scene. I think that certainty has helped that area of growth, meaning entrepreneurial spirit. And I think you also have a background as a regulator from the National Securities Exchange. So perhaps you can talk about all your experiences, what the DAI UK Fund, Prosperity Fund does, and how that ties in with a lot of this entrepreneurial spirit we've seen recently in fintech.
Sure, John, and thanks for the invitation to the panel. And well, the UK Prosperity Fund is an initiative from the UK government that aims to support the development of several Mexico initiatives. The Prosperity Fund endorses, for example, initiatives in energy. It has a program for energy, for the mobility of the cities. The program is called Future Cities, and it has also a program called Mexico Financial Services. So within this Mexico Financial Services program, what the Prosperity Fund does is to look for the financial inclusion and also to look for the motivation of the people to engage into these fintech technologies. So what I'm doing particularly with the CNBV, or the National Banking and Securities Commission, is to work mainly on 3 lines of projects. One of them is related to the development of the open finance standards. As you know, here in Mexico, the fintech law defines that the institution or the financial institutions must share their information through standardized APIs. So Mexico is the only country in the world that enables the whole financial Mexican system, because in other parts, for example, you have banks, you have insurers, you have all kind of financial entities. But here in Mexico, we're talking about 5,000 entities that have to share information through APIs. So we are supporting the CNBV, or the National Banking and Securities Commission, by developing these standards. They are based on the UK model, taking into consideration that the UK has some experience of about maybe 4 or 5 years. They started around maybe 2016. So up to date, we have already worked on the open data standard, which is related to the ATMs, for automatic teller machines. This standard will give you information, for example, if you are a tourist or if you are a customer from any bank, to look for the cheapest ATM that doesn't charge any commission or charges the least commission, for example. And we also help you to provide data, for example, if the ATM has some accessibility features for people with special abilities and so on. So this work is already done, and the good news is that the standard is about to be officially published in the government's diary, maybe in a couple of weeks. So we are about to see like these open finance models start to develop. And currently we're working with the CNBV in developing the first transactional data standard that is related to the debit accounts. And that means all accounts that, for example, when you make some savings, or when you like transfer money to some other people, that is deposit accounts. So the expectative is to have ready this standard for at the end of the year. And we're also working on the client consent, because given that it is transactional data, you as a customer must first give permission to a third party to consult and to review your information. So that is one big project that we're working on. And also we are working with CNBV to help them to strengthen their supervision faculties through a project that is called Subtech platform. And this platform will, in short, being able to receive the regulatory reports through APIs and to display all those information into several predefined dashboards that regulators and supervisors can watch and can manage in real time, so that they can have more accurate information. And also, on the other hand, the CNBV is preparing a second phase of this subtech platform, because they are thinking to add some machine learning and artificial intelligence in order to detect some patterns from financial institutions related, for example, to the risk of credit, or to operational risk, or to any other kind of financial risk that the regulator can know in advance, so that previously that the financial entity reports some trouble, the regulator already knows that that might happen if this financial entity keeps following a certain pattern. So that's the other project we're working on. And a third one is about the regulatory sandbox, because even though that this regulatory sandbox scheme exists in the fintech law, it is not well known, because as Blanca said, the law tries to encompass from a general overview, for example, crowdfunding activities, or e-money, or data sharing through APIs, or crypto assets. The fintech law is also prepared to be time-proof, and one important thing is that it promotes innovation, because the fintech law, being as general as it is, it cannot define or outline every activity that is developed through technology or through fintech. So the regulatory sandbox exists so that all those innovative projects that want to test their products and their services through technology, and that are related to a reserve activity, for example, gathering money from the public, or giving some investment accessory, all of those are which reserve activities, so that they can try as if it was some kind of a lab of financial lab, and they are also at the same time accompanied with the regulator in order to find out if the product or service is viable or will have success. So what we're doing with this regulatory sandbox is to launch an open call, so that all fintechs interested in registering their projects to this sandbox challenge contest are able to do it. And we're going to afterwards analyze every project, so that we can analyze if the project is viable to be fitted into a regulatory sandbox. And we will also have a couple of prizes in order for these fintechs to be supported, and in the end they can present their formal request to access to this regulatory sandbox. So that's what we're working on it. And also, as you were saying, I had the opportunity to be with the financial regulator. I had the opportunity to participate in the team that developed the fintech law. It was a great challenge, because usually when you develop regulation, you have to follow a series of principles. For example, that the law is technology neutral, that the law looks and has the goal to achieve financial inclusion, that in Mexico is a great opportunity. As Santiago was saying, we have very few investment accounts, and I would like to say that also we need more savings accounts and regular accounts and all kind of products and services. So the law looks to achieve that financial inclusion, and also the law looks to have or to provide some benefits to the consumers. So it was a really long project that took about 3 to 4 years, that eventually we saw results in March 2018. So from 2018 and up to date, the regulator has issued several secondary dispositions, to address certain topics. For example, what is the criteria that the crowdfunded projects must meet, for example, or what are the criteria that the regulatory sandbox projects must meet, and all things like that. But I think that overall, we have had a really good experience with fintech here in Mexico, and initiatives like the Prosperity Fund help to develop and also to encourage users to adapt and enable this kind of products and services based in financial technology.
Well, thank you very much for that detailed overview. In fact, I think we got a little bit ahead of ourselves as we're going to save Sandbox for the end, but that's great that you brought it up. So it's clear from all the participants so far that the regulatory initiatives in Mexico have actually helped spur some entrepreneurialism and create a lot of fintech companies. But there are just general market opportunities that have been created over time because of things like smartphone adoption. And I know Santiago earlier talked about how there's only 300,000 brokerage accounts versus that of the US, where almost 50% of everyone is on their app. And part of what we're trying to do here is to understand how Mexico is creating inclusion with the market opportunities that exist. How is the smartphone, I guess, adoption helping you? If you look at, you use Robinhood as an example, in the US, that is really a brokerage platform that is mobile first, and very few people millennials who use it in the US don't even go on their PC to access their Robinhood. It's just so easy for them to use the user interface, the innovation in terms of fractional trading to make it more democratized. People can buy any type of share, even if it's $1,000 type stock. Does BIVA have any initiatives here to grow their brokerage accounts using a smartphone first or mobile first strategy?
Yeah, that's a great point. As we've been mentioning, all of us, I think we have the same speech that financial inclusion needs to be widened, and we need to throw a wider net into the population in order to get more financial inclusion in all aspects of the not just in the stock market or financial markets, but in finances overall. A high percentage of the Mexican population is underbanked, as Blanca was saying. So I think there's two pillars in which we, at least in BIVA, we focus on, and we try to, by law here in Mexico, if you're a retail user or even an institutional investor, you cannot connect directly to an exchange. You need to go through a broker. So we're working together with the brokers in order to make two things. One of the pillars I was mentioning is education. We need to educate people in order for them to get a better understanding of their financial availability or financial opportunity they have. Being it remittances, as Kevin was saying, being it just opening up a savings account or opening up an Afore account, or sophisticated as trading in the stock market on either exchange. So one of the main pillars is we're working with over 100 universities here in Mexico. We have a educational platform called Instituto BIVA, and this BIVA Institute, what it looks for is to have people being more aware of their financial opportunities and what's out there in the market, and how can they exploit it and make better use of their money, especially given those fintechs being created around the world and starting to give them more visibility. We want to working together with the broker dealers here in Mexico. As I was mentioning, there are 35 brokers here in Mexico. There are only 6 or 7 trading platforms here in Mexico. As in the US, there are probably hundreds. Here there are only 6 or 7. We're working with them in order for them to promote themselves. And this brings me to the second pillar of our efforts, which is accessibility. We need to make it more accessible for people to access the securities market, but financial markets overall. Even how to buy a government bond. Just to not lose not to put their cash in the cushion. There was a program here launched by the administration just about 10 years ago called the CETES Directo. It's a great initiative in which you log into your account and you can buy directly as a retail customer government bonds without trading commissions. There's no intermediary. This program, even though it's a great initiative, in over 10 years of existence, it's grown to just over 400,000 users. This user base should be in the millions. If you have an account which wouldn't charge you a dime in order to trade government bonds, it should be a no-brainer to open it up. But it only has reached 400,000 people. So we're we're working together with the brokers in order for them to help them grow their investor base, their retail base. There are quite a few platforms. I mean, the 7 I was mentioning, most of them are doing some sort of revamp in some sort of area, and we're trying to double the brokerage accounts here in Mexico in the next year. Last year, I mean, as I mentioned, we launched in 2018, and last year was the greatest year for accounts in the history of the Mexican securities market. I mean, and it was just like over 60,000 new accounts open. So the bar is really set really low, if you want to put it that way. But basically, what we're doing is focusing on education and on accessibility. Those are the main pillars we're attacking with a lot of initiatives and trying to work with all of the ecosystem in the financial markets. And yeah, well, and we'll get into more things later. But I think there are really some really innovative and new fintech companies that their aim is just to do that, to bring more access to people to financial markets.
That's great. I mean, it seems like people are working so hard to bring people to traditional financial markets. As Kevin said earlier, it seems like on the crypto markets, especially since COVID started, the adoption for crypto has really almost gone hyperbolic. I mean, it's all of Latin America, not just Mexico. And Kevin, maybe you can talk about how AVA can help some of the most common uses that's happening in Latin America or Mexico.
Yeah, it's not, without making it too much about AVA, and just generally about lots of the next generation blockchain platforms. I mean, the biggest value add here, the first thing really to answer that question, we need to, I think, make clear the value proposition of what crypto networks and just blockchain networks in general allow, and then go on to, okay, there is a potential dream here. What is the best technology to use out there? So the first part of the question, I think I alluded to several times. I'm seeing the colleagues here in the panel are obviously very much concerned about the regulatory environment, and the regulatory environment is incredibly important. But as far as as far as the regulatory environment goes, it oftentimes can stifle a lot of innovation. So whether we like it or not, the regulatory stuff that has been placed about from governments. The only way to move that forward is if innovators come along, they bring in new technology, and they push that boundary of the regulatory environment, whether the regulators like it or not. Typically speaking, in good direction that are positive for the world. We saw, for example, the same thing happening with the music industry. Initially was controlled by a few entities that basically were the middlemen on everything, and the regulatory overhead made basically everything impossible for anybody to be free with their music. And the same thing is probably going to happen with financial inclusion. Financial services are going to become a program. They're going to become available on these open platforms, and they're going to become more accessible, which means that it needs to be the case that the regulatory environment needs to sort of work around these new innovations. And at the forefront of these innovations is blockchain technologies. The blockchain technologies are making capital programmable. They're opening up sort of Pandora's box as far as finance goes, which means there's going to be probably a lot of headaches for regulators. But again, ultimately, this is good because it reduces the intermediaries that are there in the financial world. It reduces costs. It makes things much more efficient. It gives people the power to hold onto their finances in more sort of private ways, in more empowering ways. And in general, this is by far the biggest value add of blockchain networks. Again, it's in really pushing away all of the crummy, old, outdated rules that have been placed on and made financial inclusion so impossible. This is never going to happen by regulators on their own will. It's going to only happen with new technology coming in and pushing the sphere forward. and rolling it down the court. Nobody else, and the regulators are just going to twiddle their thumbs and do absolutely nothing if the innovators don't come along and just push it. So that's what really blockchain networks are going to do. And obviously, at the forefront of these technologies is probably AVA. And what we're doing here is building an incredibly powerful platform that gives. It's kind of like the internet. We're building the internet really here, and we're telling people that using this internet, you can build amazing new financial inclusion products. We've seen, as I said, sort of glimpses of this happening in other platforms already, like Ethereum. Lots of interesting new financial products are being built on Ethereum. Of course, it's not a platform for large scale, so lots of use cases are also failing. But the latest generation of blockchain platforms are going to make this dream very, very possible. So, I think blockchain technology it's still very, very young, because the complexity of pushing the needle forward here is quite heavy. And I think there's a few more years before blockchain really catches on. But I think for the very first time, I think we're seeing some legitimate, honest use cases from blockchain technology actually pushing forward the outdated systems in a positive way, making remittance cheaper. They're still very early on, but we're going there. Making the ability for people to, or providing the ability for people to hold on to their finances in more private ways, in more sort of self-sovereign ways. This is also sort of incrementing slowly and over time, reducing a lot of costs that are associated with middlemen. This is very slow, but it's picking up steam. And ultimately, it's just about transforming how we move capital around, and potentially, even bigger dreams of making everything available and easily discoverable. So it makes a lot of assets that we have that are maybe sitting out there because they don't have anywhere to go, much more liquid. And so that's the sort of the next phase of the evolution here.
Thanks, Kevin. Blanca, I noticed you had some wonderful facial expressions while Kevin was speaking. Maybe we can comment on a few of those. I think I heard or saw you smile when he talked about how entrepreneurs and innovators are pushing the boundaries. And I know you've been a consultant for quite some time at KPMG, consulting both from a technology innovation perspective, but as well as how to work within the rules of the regulators. So maybe you can talk about the fact that entrepreneurs can push the boundaries here, especially as it pertains to blockchain, because blockchain and crypto people, frankly, have had a very strong effect on many countries in emerging markets in terms of adoption, in terms of market opportunity and financial inclusion and access to things that they did not have in the past. You're on mute, Blanca.
Thank you. So yeah, blockchain, I do believe it's a very powerful solution that can solve many challenges for third world countries, especially Mexican and Latin American markets. For example, this remittances case is very evident. It is very complicated for people in our country to access with some opportunity these funds. They're losing lots of them in the intermediary process. It's taking a lot of time. Most of the time they're making, for example, 5 to 10 hours in a line waiting for these physical places to open, and they eventually get out of cash. And well, there's a lot of complications. So I believe there is a very honest intention from the Mexican regulators to really tap the opportunities that technology provides in order to create effective, efficient, and adaptable solutions, because our market is very attached to cash. That's one of the challenges in a culture as the Mexican one. But we need to help the regulator, us as advisors and naturally entrepreneurs, with lots of patience, education, and of most of all identifying risks, because That's the purpose of regulation. That's why it exists, to be able to grasp and identify these small nuances and risks, and being able to provide a strong and exhaustive frameworks for solving those problems and protecting the final users, the clients, the client's money, and also creating trustworthiness, and creating a really collaborative ecosystem in the financial sector. So as long as we help the regulator identify where are the risks in relation to data privacy, to cybersecurity, to information being robbed or cyber attacks, for example. What about having some financial risk management, for example, market liquidity, reserves, capitalization? What about being very transparent in finance management and being able to publish every now and then some financial statements for creating reports and trust and the market, gaining the market trust? That kind of things, they're very important to address from the entrepreneurial side and from our side as advisors, so that the regulator will give these steps forward with some confidence, and instead of being like sometimes perceived as enemies because the regulator wants to kill innovation and the fintechs want to be innovative without having to comply with these complicated frameworks and regulations. They can work together. And for example, I believe what Raul was mentioning about this subtext solution, that's really cool, amazing, and most of it important, because imagine having as the National Commission the power to just like activate this extraction, transformation, and load process, so to say, or consuming information in almost real time through an API, and being able to have at just one glance the whole picture of the financial ecosystem or the sector, or how a fintech's going, if they are right now operating in black numbers, are they still missing some funds, are they in need of venture capital or equity investments, and then you as the regulator identify these gaps and then create some kind of program to invite people from other countries, for example, venture capitalists here in the US, please come invest in these companies, they are thriving, they are growing, they have lots of market share, so please help us make this bigger, stronger, and a more mature market, no? Right. So yeah, that's the reason why I was smiling, because that makes a lot of sense in markets like Mexico.
So as Kevin was speaking, I noticed Raul had a very serious face on. It's almost like taking the opposite view, and he was a former regulator. I think he probably takes some offense to the comment that regulators are there to stifle growth, but I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I'll give Raul in a second a chance to talk about that. But before that, Raul, in the US, there are two types of startups or entrepreneurs in the fintech space. One group, basically, they push very hard and then they ask for forgiveness from the regulators. Another group, they ask for permission before they do anything. What is the environment like in Mexico? Are the startups there, the entrepreneurs over there, the former or the latter? And is, as a former regulator, is the regulator there to stifle innovation?
Okay, well, I think that that depends on the type of fintech, because as we were saying, we have here in Mexico around 400 fintechs, and it is important to say that not all of them need to be regulated. So in the end, for the fintechs that do not need to be regulated, they can like innovate at the pace that they want, because it's only about the beneficial or the benefits for the end customer. But on the other hand, we have the regulated fintechs, and in this case, you have to ask first for permission in order to start activities. And I think that I was a little bit serious when Kevin was saying that the innovators must push forward with these developments, and I agree, and I actually agree But I think that one of the problems that we have found here in Mexico is that, for example, the regulatory sandbox schema is not well known or is not well understood. So, for example, what we found out in financial entities such as banks is that, for example, when the business guy comes to the board and say, oh, okay, we're going to migrate some processes to the cloud because it will save us a lot of money, it will make us more efficient. And then the complaints guy says, okay, stop, I mean, you cannot do it, okay? But in the end, you can do it. The thing is that you don't know how to interpret the regulation. No? So that happens, or that usually happens in the regulated financial entities. But on the other hand, for example, in fintechs, you have like a very defined or predefined set of concepts and rules and guidelines. But it might happen that you want to interpret the law as you understand, and that might not be the best option because in the end you might have some penalties. The penalties can go from a few amounts of money to jail or imprisonment. It's been known that the National Banking and Securities Commission has not put anyone in jail in a couple of years, so I think that won't be like the usual route, but in the end you will get a penalty, maybe an economic penalty. So the best advice is to always to ask a lawyer, and in the case that you are a financial regulated fintech, and then to go ahead with the innovation, because in the end the law says that you can do whatever you imagine or the idea that you want to prove, you can do it. But since there are a lot of risk involved, for example, one of the main risks, and that risk has happened in Mexico a couple of times, is imagine that, for example, you see a platform and then you start investing and the platform has your money, but it turns out that it's a scam, or that the next day the platform disappears, and then who would you complain? I mean, you might blame the regulator, you might blame an authority, the finance ministry, but in the end you won't have your money. So thinking in those kind of risks that in Mexico have happened, maybe because of our culture, what the law tries to do is to mitigate all those risks. So what the law says is, okay, go ahead, the innovation is open, but how about if you go along with the regulator? Because, for example, as Kevin was saying, the remittance case is like a very good example for it, because in the end you are transmitting money, and there are a lot of outdated systems that might not work in our today's reality, because you can have like your money in seconds from one place to another, and you can do it, but in the end you have to know how to do it. No? So that's right. I think that's the conclusion.
Well, I think one of your suggestions was to check with a lawyer. I don't know about the Mexican lawyers, but in the US, I agree you should check with lawyers, but sometimes after you check with the lawyer, you're actually more confused than you were before. So that becomes a problem in itself. Santiago, what is your experience as an entrepreneur with the Sandbox framework, and has it helped you at all?
I think it's a great opportunity. It's a relatively new effort here in the Mexican market. Regarding your previous discussion, I actually agree with Kevin. By nature, regulation should come after innovation. You should innovate, and after that, regulation should catch up, and not the other way around. Especially if you're in a space where these startups or new companies, really new and innovative business models, if you put a regulatory overhead into their costs, they're probably, a lot of them are not going to make it past that. So I think the sandbox comes as an opportunity in order for you to prove your business model that it works, and how much, if at all, it should be regulated, and in order for you to like make a proper identification of the costs and the regulatory place where your company should fit. But if you put a lot of overhead and if you regulate before you innovate, you're going to end up with nothing. I mean, you're going to stifle innovation, and that should not happen at all. I mean, and right now you're seeing the US subpoena Zuckerberg and all the other guys, because the regulation should catch up to innovation. And yeah, it could be a nuisance and it could be problematic sometimes, but that's by nature, it's the way it should work. And you shouldn't lay the ground rules before there's anything to fill with. I mean, if there are no companies to regulate, why should you do a law with no recipients, right? So that's just my point of view in that regard. Regarding BIVA, as I mentioned, we started BIVA way back, and basically the law was already made. I mean, for more than one exchange to exist. You mentioned, John, that you used to work at Shares Post. Basically, I mean, if it's allowed by law, and it depends on how you interpret it. I mean, there can be extra. I mean, we call them here extra bursátiles, like platforms on non-regulated platforms to trade private stocks. Here in Mexico, that opportunity exists as well, but it depends on how you interpret regulation. So as Raul was mentioning, you should be careful with. You should consult with lawyers, but you should have your idea really well placed and well in mind, and see the way on how to do it, and not on how not to do it. I mean, you should always focus on the way forward and use what's already out there regarding the regulation. And if there's nothing out there, I mean, just try to interpret it the way it best suits you, right? I mean, not going overboard.
Right. Earlier, Santiago, you talked about how you've had great growth on your exchange in terms of brokerage accounts. However, the wallets on the crypto exchanges have just exploded and far outpaced the growth you've seen in your traditional exchange. Yeah, is that because there is less rules, or there are clear rules, or that just people don't care about the rules?
It's because there are less rules. There's more accessibility. I mean, for instance, last year, if you wanted to open up a brokerage account, you had to go to a bank, to a casa de bolsa, to a broker dealer, and sign physical documents. I mean, and if you want to open up a crypto wallet, you can do it in like a matter of minutes. And right now, the rules are changing because the broker dealers are learning to interpret the regulation, and they're starting to do online trading accounts, which are you can open them up in a matter of seconds, and you can fund them. I mean, you can start. I mean, there was a huge misconception that like trading securities was for the big fish. I mean, and you needed to have at least $1 million pesos to be in the securities market, which is complete nonsense. And the broker dealers, especially the 7 platforms I was mentioning, they're really trying to break those barriers. They're opening up accounts of 100 pesos, and we're working with them, giving them, for instance, for the retail platforms, we don't charge them basically nothing for their market data, and they can get real-time market data from BIVA for their customers for nothing. So we're trying to grow the retail base by, I mean, there were really these misconceptions about the securities market, which stifled its growth, and we're really working hard into breaking those misconceptions. And the crypto space, it was born as a really strong trend and an unregulated trend, and with 0 barriers of entry. I mean, you can open up a trading account in a matter of seconds and fund it with 10 pesos. I mean, so there's, I mean, it's not just a fashion, but I mean, it's here to stay, of course. But I mean, it's new. It's easier to access it. I mean, or it's not easier, but the sense of it being easier is what I think has tipped the scales into their side.
Right. Kevin, I think you should pack your bags and move to Mexico very quickly and do your job there.
That's still the case, yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't want to make this too much about AVA, Kevin, but can you talk about how fast our community has grown in Mexico in the last, and maybe in percentage terms as opposed to absolute terms, just in the last couple of months?
I'm not quite sure about the percentage terms, to be honest, or the absolute terms, but I do know that it's significant, and it's very exciting to see. I think it's because we see, unlike other projects, a huge, tremendous opportunity there in that market. I mean, the challenges, and I mean the overheads and you know, sort of just overall craziness of doing basic things in there. I mean, I think a lot of the innovators in the fintech space in general have almost entirely focused on the major markets like US and maybe Europe. And of course, there's the isolated copies of Asia side, but very little in Latin America. And I think there's a huge opportunity for crypto networks to come in there and change a lot of things. So I think we're identifying that from the AVA side, and we're really going after it.
That's great. Blanca, you're in the business of consulting and giving advice to people like Kevin, especially from a sandboxing perspective and working within that framework. What kind of advice can you give Kevin as he packs his bags and moves to Mexico?
I'm sorry. You should definitely come, Kevin. Mexico is a very promising and potential market. There's still so much to do. And for example, in the difference between having a really defined business model and what AVA is doing is a very big one. And that's why I believe technological habilitators have so much importance, and they should come as quickly as they can to the Mexican market, because they are the ones that are going to be really making these business models in the fintech space grow to significant numbers, and getting these investments from, for example, a SoftBank company with hundreds of millions of dollars. Because, for example, the main business models that we observed at the beginning of this year here in Mexico were focused mainly on crowdfunding and crowdlending and that space. In the other hand, they were these electronic payments, electronic funds like e-wallets and some loyalty programs. And there's a lot of companies focusing on transborder money transferring and remittances. We actually observed a growing trend, I believe, from the 406 companies that there exist right now in Mexico. About 30 belong to the insurtech space, for example. So there's a lot of going on in there, and there's almost around 20 challenger banks, neobanks, or digital branching banks here in Mexico. So if you observe all these models, all these business models need a lot of help in relation to technology supporting systems. For example, maybe core banking is going to be modular or based on Kubernetes and services. They need to have this centralized network that will easily allow them to interact with each other and to comply with the future of or the coming open finance and open banking regulation that is being developed at the moment. So blockchain technology and platforms in general that provide anything as a service make a lot of sense. Someone that can help with the back office of these fintech companies with banking as a service, open banking as a service, blockchain as a service, if I may say, if something like that exists, it makes a lot of sense for technology providers coming to Mexico and helping these companies really evolve and get it to the next level.
Thank you. So we're running short on time, so I only have one more question for everyone, and everyone needs to answer this in a relatively concise manner. I will start with Raul. Raul, in the next 3 years, what is most exciting to you in terms of fintech innovation in Mexico?
Well, I see for me, I see a couple of models. For example, one of them is the one that has already mentioned regarding open finance, because we will see a lot of third parties from the fintechs that are just starting to big companies like maybe Facebook's, Google's, Amazon's, that will want to apply to have this client information. So I think that will reshape the financing industry in Mexico within a few years. Also, I think in the case of the brokerage business, the National Banking and Securities Commission is preparing regulation for robo-advisors. So, for example, this kind of new technologies with robo-advisors and the flexibilization in opening accounts through remote media and biometric identification and new technologies, I think that will empower and will help to grow the brokerage industry. And the third one, I see that blockchain technology will also play a very important role. Kevin was saying about the remittance case, which in Mexico is very feasible because Mexico is a country that is heavily dependent on remittances. And there are also actually a couple of projects like trying to find out what is the business model regarding remittances and blockchain technology. And also blockchain technology, we'll see in other uses, for example, maybe for like property verification, like maybe for data validation. So I think that in my personal point of view, I see those three use cases like in the next 3 years, like going live and developing and growing up.
We're seeing a lot of those types of use cases in our partners coming to us at AVA and asking us to work with them, very related to what you just said. Santiago, in the next couple of years, what's most exciting for you and either your firm or what you see in the fintech landscape there?
Yeah, sure. I concur with Raul. I see blockchain playing an important role, especially in my business, in the securities exchange business. I mean, for issuers as well as for traders, we see it as the next big thing. It's going to happen eventually, and it's going to have its use cases. For instance, we're doing a securities lending model using blockchain, and we're going to start with those, and then we're going to do something major. But it's going to be step by step. But we would definitely see it as a major trend in the coming years. We also see barriers reduced, entry barriers for the financial markets reduced, in order for more people to be in the formal financial system. This is going to be really, I think, in my point of view, very incentivized by the administration. They want to get more people into the formal financial framework. And we're also going to see new companies and new business lines, given the sandbox and the new use cases and all the new fintechs that are out there, not only in Mexico, but in the whole LATAM and everywhere in the world. I mean, there's a lot of new businesses to be done with this technology that's changing on a daily basis. So definitely new business lines in the next few years. And I think, just to conclude, that the sandbox is a really great opportunity to test out business models and see if you fit within the regulation or not. But I think it's a great thing to have it as an option.
Right. Thank you. Kevin, you lost your video, but very quickly, for AVA or for blockchain in Mexico in the next 2 years, what do you see as the most exciting opportunity?
I think Santiago absolutely nailed it there. I totally concur with him on all those points. I mean, if I were to really dream, I want to see a complete transformation of how we do finance properly, using like actually good technology, sort of have a common standard on how we communicate with what assets are, build on those standards in an open way, in exactly the same way as people build on, for example, Amazon Web Services. So there's not going to be a single person that's going to come out there and fix all the issues with, bank back offices and insurtech, and there's not going to be such a thing. But once you do create a platform that has a unified standard and you allow people to develop on top of it, then all of those things will slowly start unraveling. That's a big dream. I'm not sure if it's going to happen in 2 years. I am confident it's going to happen in the years to come. And in the short term, at the very least, in the next 2 years, if I were to sort of take it down a few gears on the dreaming, then I will at least hope to see some legitimate disruption in the current lines of businesses, even if it's a small percentage, but chipping away at all of the crazy overhead and remittance, all of the craziness that happens with how we manage money. Even if we change that slightly a little bit, I think that will be a fantastic transformation to finance in the next 2 years.
Well, Santiago's already said that he would like help with settling and clearing on the exchange. So maybe AVA can help build a system there for him.
That's true. That's true.
Blanca, any thoughts on what's most exciting to you in the next couple of years?
Yes, actually, our perspective has changed for the last couple of months because we had some ideas before this current health crisis appeared. So for this new normality that has been named like that, we believe that smart contracts, it's going to be a real game changer because it's going to allow every single player in the financial ecosystem to keep on providing services, to contracting products without having to comply with these regulations and without having physical or geographical restrictions. So yes, smart contracts, I think it's going to be a trend that is going to grow in a very significant way. And of course, my own favorite, because I'm a data person, is artificial intelligence. I believe there's a true key for financial inclusion. Alternative scorings and identifying a way of really creating fair and democratic scoring for people in order to include them in the financial system is a relevant thing that will be changing the way we operate financial products at the time. So that would be my final remarks.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much. You guys have been fantastic and giving us great insight and knowledge in the space. And we hope we can do this again soon. Thank you very much.